It can be said that history is a matter of perspective. And I think when it comes to magic, that's doubly true. But you can't understand a thing without knowing where it came from. And this is the Emergent Magick perspective on the history of magic. Hey folks, this is James, aka Thresciornis. And if you've been watching this podcast for a little while, you've probably figured out that I am a big history nerd. And you're going to get a history lesson every time that I talk about a subject. And that's why the first official chapter in the Emergent Magick book is about the history of magic. Two things to understand before we get started. One, obviously, you can't cover the history of magic in a single chapter, or a single video, or even in a single book. It would take volumes to cover the subject, and even then, you'd probably end up leaving some things out. This is an extremely short overview. Two, it comes from an Emergent Magick perspective. The things we chose to cover were what was important to EMK. While I wouldn't say that any of it isn't accurate, it is definitely from the EMK perspective. And as the late great Gord Downie said, half the truth is just how much there is. As I've said before, we pick the quotes for the book carefully. They truly are important. And this quote in particular is probably my favorite because it comes from my hero, Canadian anthropologist Wade Davis. We have this extraordinary conceit in the West that while we've been hard at work in the creation of technological wizardry and innovation, somehow the other cultures of the world have been intellectually idle. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nor is this difference due to some sort of inherent Western superiority. We now know to be true biologically what we've always dreamed to be true philosophically. And that is that we are all brothers and sisters. We are all, by definition, cut from the same genetic cloth. That means every single human society and culture, by definition, shares the same raw mental activity, the same intellectual capacity, and whether that raw genius is placed in the service of technological wizardry or unraveling the complex thread of memory inherent in a myth is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. This is important because it applies not only to our current culture groups, but also to people of the past. That they were just as smart as us, just as capable as us, just as resourceful and observant. There's no such thing as primitive people. It also applies to the people who lived for over 250,000 years of prehistory, our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And one thing that the vast majority of these cultures embraced is the art of magic. I hear a lot of people say that ancient magical practices don't matter that much, that what's new is what's important. While it's true that magic has advanced, even in the modern era, it is also true that ancient cultures spent much more of their resources on the study of magic than that of our modern Western cultures. Here's an analogy that I think is apt. The United States spends more on its military than pretty much all other countries in the world combined. You can bet that we have a strong military. It's not invincible. We've lost wars before. But still, there's about a 0% chance of an attack on American soil. So when you look at a culture like the ancient Egyptians, who spent so much in time, money, and just mental energy on the art of magic, you ignore that to your own detriment. You shouldn't be a slave to it, but absolutely you should know it. With that in mind, let's take a look at the magic of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. You know, that state of society in which the human race has spent the majority of its time on this planet. Most scholars agree that the predominant spiritual belief of our hunter-gatherer ancestors was animism. And thanks to the excellent YouTube channel of Rune Rasmussen, I finally found a definition I can get behind. Religious studies scholar Graham Harvey defines animism this way. Animism is the belief that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. In essence, what we're talking about here is the spirit model, that the first magicians gained their knowledge and ability by communicating with the spirits, learning from the spirits of the land, spirits of plants, spirits of the dead, and sometimes even alien spirits that were often associated with celestial bodies. The first evidence we find of any spiritual practice comes in the form of grave goods, items buried with the dead. Even our hominid cousins, the Neanderthals, did this. But looking at later beliefs on the subject, the purpose of these burials becomes clear. Since the beginning, we believed in some kind of afterlife, that the items buried with the dead would be needed by them in the world beyond. Keep in mind that all evidence points towards prehistoric people having advanced forms of spiritual thought and practices. And nothing proves this more than the archaeological find at Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe turned history on its head. Up until when Göbekli Tepe was found, the general consensus amongst historians was that first humans built permanent settlements, then a specialty class developed, and then religious structures and monuments were built. Göbekli Tepe, by virtue of being older than any city, and obviously built by hunter-gatherers, disproves that notion, and shows that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were capable of great works. It does seem, however, that when civilization arose, an effort was underway to restrict people from access to the spirits and restrict access to the afterlife. A priestly class developed, and it was married to the power of the state. Magic became more formalized, and it was more about saying the right words at the right time as prescribed by the priests. Of course, those who used magic in the old ways were still there, but at this time, persecution started. That magic was seen as wrong or evil. And this would continue in the West up through the Middle Ages and even until the Enlightenment. Okay, so we're going to skip a lot here and focus on the things that have had a direct influence on emergent magic and an influence on pretty much every modern magical system in the West. And what I'm talking about is a thing that started in the 1600s called the Magical Revival. The Magical Revival was pretty much started by a semi-secret organization called the Rosicrucians, who were attempting to come up with a universal magic that could be reconciled with science. They combined alchemy, Kabbalah, and Hermeticism. Later, some of the Rosicrucian rituals and beliefs were adopted by Masonic societies. They influenced the later English Magical Revival, which included such famous organizations as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the Theosophical Society. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn had amongst its members various luminaries and artists of the time, including A.E. Waite, William Butler Yeats, Pamela Colman Smith, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Bram Stoker, with the most influential graduate of the Golden Dawn being one Aleister Crowley. Crowley can be considered a controversial figure for a lot of people. I know I've been accused of Crowley bashing, but one thing I will not deny is that he, as a single individual, has probably had the largest influence on modern magic. He was definitely a formidable person and a great magus. In 1904, Crowley and his new bride, Rose, took a trip to Egypt. There, they channeled the spirit of an ancient Egyptian priest and wrote a book called Liber al-Leges, or the Book of the Law. Liber al sets the foundation for Crowley's magical religion called Thelema. Thelema means will in Greek and refers to a person's true will, that which they were born to accomplish. The most important commandment of Thelema is, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will." In 1915, Crowley co-opted a German Masonic organization called the Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, and turned it into his own religious organization based on Thelema. Crowley wrote numerous books and also created a purely magical organization called the AA. Crowley's magical system contained a mixture of Eastern and Western magical techniques, from yoga to Kabbalah. His mythology included obscure Egyptian deities and figures from the Book of Revelation. Crowley's organizations continue to use Masonic-style initiations and grade systems. Perhaps Crowley's greatest contribution to magic is not his magical system itself, but giving the Western esoteric tradition a theological framework based on liberation. The law of Thelema, the central tenet of Crowley's belief system, has a broad appeal and has been embraced by many magi, even those who don't work within Crowley's own magical paradigm. His legend earned him the attention of the Beatles, most likely John Lennon, and he was included on the cover of their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Crowley's followers would say that this was a result of his magic influence on the age. Later countercultural phenomena like the beatniks, hippies, and the psychedelic movement owe much to Crowley's influence. Crowley's organizations grew after his death and are now more popular than when he was alive. Crowley's work had a direct influence on the neo-pagan movement. In 1951, an Englishman named Gerald Gardner, a known associate of Crowley, started a religion called Wicca. This was supposedly passed down from generations of witches from which Gardner was initiated. While there's little evidence of this, Gardner can be credited with pretty much starting the entire neo-pagan movement. And also, later on, interest in Wicca led to interest in traditional witchcraft, which is popular today. Which brings us to Emergent Magick's direct predecessor and major influence, Chaos Magic. In 1976, two men from West Yorkshire, Peter J. Carroll and Ray Sherwin, began meeting with a few others above Sherwin's bookstore. They developed a new system of magic and later founded the Magical Pact of the Illuminants of Thanateros. Chaos magic was heavily influenced by Aleister Crowley, Austin Osman Spare, and the fantasy and science fiction authors of the time. Chaos magic does not advocate for one particular belief system. Chaos magic is essentially a series of techniques learned by magicians in order to provoke altered states of consciousness or gnosis. For chaos magicians, belief is a tool, something that's applied to magic but can be changed or interchanged easily by still using the same techniques and methods applied to older forms of magic. EMK also draws influence from the counterculture of the 1960s, particularly the psychedelic movement. Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and the culture surrounding the Grateful Dead all espouse the use of psychedelics in the creation of neo-tribal societies based on community and individual freedom. In our view, the great social experiment of the 1960s led to greater rights for women and minorities and general enfranchisement. The reaction of the totalitarian right ended this progress abruptly. EMK seeks to refine the methods used by these early counterculture heroes and lead that experiment to fruition. So now you know where Emergent Magick is coming from, and in later videos, we'll explain our purpose for creating EMK and how it differs from other magical systems. So you know, if you want to see more Scroll of Thoth, you gotta like and subscribe. If you want to help the show directly, go to our Ko-Fi page where we're taking donations for our trip to Egypt. We've got merch at our Redbubble store. And hey, why not get yourself a copy of Emergent Magick, Rebuilding Our Tribes Through Ritual and Meaning. Thank you so much for watching to the end, and we'll see you next time.